sports fans. This is Dr. K from Omaha, Nebraska, and we're coming to you with the next installment, Volume 9 of the Turf Racing Series. Let's talk a little bit about come home times, middle fractions, and what that really means in the context of how a race works. And then we're going to take those two concepts and put them into action in how we can make par charts that will really help you and make it much easier for you to apply come home times and middle fractions. So let's start with the whole idea of what is a middle fraction. A middle fraction is basically the middle third of a race. The first part in a sprint would be like the first 2 furlongs, so from 4 to say 6 furlongs would be the middle fraction there. And then the come home time would be from the 4 furlong in on whatever the sprint is, whether it's 5 furlongs, 5.5, 6, 6.5, 7, whatever. But the come home time is always the most important time, but it's not the only important time. Jim Quinn and others have talked about that the middle fraction matters. And Andy Beyer, I think his best contribution to racing is actually what I call the Beyer number, which isn't what you see in the racing form at all. But the Beyer number basically combines the middle fraction and the come home time. And what he says is that that number, combining those two, is actually the most important thing in turf racing. But I like to break it up still into the two different fractions and then do it that way. But of course, what really happens, even once you do the math, and the math is pretty easy, but once you do the math, you've got to put it in a particular context. And so even though you're going to end up almost always with the closers with huge and much greater come home times, that sometimes their middle fractions aren't very good. And so when you just lay it out in terms of trying to who's got the best numbers, you've got to take into account one other thing, and that's how far back the horse is at the time of when they get to the 2 furlong if it's a sprint, or 4 furlong in the route, and then also before we figure out the come home times. You've got to punish a horse for being a certain number of lengths back. So it would make perfect sense for a deep closer who's maybe 5 lengths back. You've got to take that out from the middle fraction or from the come home time. You've just got to do it, because if you think about it, just by definition, a come home type of horse, a horse that's got this great come home time, again, probably deep closer, but that horse has a lot more energy and reserve at that point. And because of that, you've got to take away the lengths. So even after we go through and we show you how to make the par charts, and the math again is going to be very easy, you've got to make sure to take out how many lengths behind they are at the first call and then the second call. So let's talk a little bit now about where do we get the data to which to make these par charts. We'd mentioned in the last installment of this series that you've got to have a place to go get par chart data. And par time data is best found in a place called horsestreet.com. horsestreet.com. It's run by Dave Schwartz. He's absolutely genius in putting this stuff together. I've been using this stuff for, I don't know, I want to say 16, 17 years, something like that. And I just think his product is so much better than everybody else's. And so what I have up here on the screen right here is an example of one of his par-time charts. And this is for Saratoga, my favorite track on earth. And what it not only lists the various distances and the par times for the various distances, but it also gives you an idea of the class. And that's really kind of important to the figuring of the par charts. One of the things that Jim Quinn talks about in a lot of his books and articles and things like that is that using like the normal par chart, the 100 level is like the $10,000 claimer. And as Jim says, you can't do that in turf racing. You've got to use a much higher level. And so in the case like this, you need to go to basically whatever is the next highest level below the non-graded stakes races. So you can see from the top, you've got graded stakes at the top. You've got non-graded stakes, which would be overnight stakes second. But then the third level is the optional claimer 100,000. And that's the number that, even though it's listed at over 112 here, we're going to call it 100 in our system. it's really important to use something that's just right below the overnight stake, because what that really means is when a horse, then when you calculate the numbers, horses that are 100 and up are really good horses. They're almost into the overnight stake category, almost to the graded stake category. So I like using the 100 not at the $10,000 claiming level like all par charts do, but I use it for a much higher level, because then when you see it, you know you've got a really good horse. And so we're going to be making a par chart for the mile and the 16th, and the par chart that I'm going to show you in a second isn't from this data, but it's from an example of another data. But just think about the data that you'd want to use in this case. If you're, say, looking at the mile, you would sit there and say, well, it's 47.92, 111.99, and 135.12. So the middle fraction for this would be the 111.99 minus the 47.92, which would be 24.07. That would be your 100 level that you would want to do. And then for the come home number, it would be the 35.12 minus the 111.99, which would be 23.13. And so that's how easy it is to do, to come up with a middle fraction and a come home number at the same time. So now let's talk about it. So now you've got those two numbers together. How do we make a par chart that really makes some sense? The example that I have here on the screen is actually from a bunch of books that I had before that I had put together. Before I had developed the Excel spreadsheet and just made it easy with the Excel spreadsheets, what I used to do is I would take the par numbers that we just looked at, and I'd call that the 100 level, and then I would add and subtract for the middle fraction, which is the first column, and then the final fraction, the come home time, in the second column. And then I would just add points based on the difference of about 0.13, 0.14, depending on the track. My software gives us the exact number and calculates this exactly. But the cool thing about this is if you just want to put together the Excel spreadsheet and then print it out for every track and every distance, you can do that. I used to actually have a notebook that was about that, and I'd have tabs for each of the tracks, and then I'd have the distances listed on each of these charts as well. But that can sometimes be an easier way than going through the Excel spreadsheet every day for every horse. Sometimes it's just easier to flip, to the track and to the distance and get the number from these charts. It's whatever you want to do. Again, I like to use the software, and just because it's just all there, it's easy. I'm not kind of used to it. But another way to do it would be that you could easily put this together on your own Excel spreadsheet using the numbers from the Horse Street pars that we talked about just a few minutes ago, using the very high level right below the overnight stake, and using that as your 100 level. And you could add whether or subtract depending on whether you're going up and down on this chart. Some people will use 0.16 because that's typically what mathematicians have figured out is about the length of an actual length is about 0.16 or slightly more than. But I found out that within the course of looking at these particular fractions, whether it's the middle fraction or the come home, that it's actually a little bit less than that, and so that's why the chart is as it is. But the really cool thing is it's not that hard to do, whether you put it on an Excel spreadsheet and print it out like this one is, or you just type in the numbers and end up with a set of numbers and write it down on your racing form. Whichever way you want to do it, it definitely is a good way to go and an easy way to use the par numbers. So once you've made these par charts, the last step is to make sure that you've adjusted for the lengths back, and then you end up with a final set of numbers. Again, whether you want to keep it on an Excel spreadsheet like I do it, or if you want to write it on your racing form also, that works out great too. But the main thing is then you're trying to figure out if it's a front runner, is it going to be able to move fast enough in the middle fraction to maintain its lead? And so that's why you compare all the middle fraction times, and then you apply the final fraction to see if it's fast enough to hold on that lead. If it's a presser, you need to make sure that it's got a middle fraction that keeps it competitive during the race. And then the closers usually have to have two moves. One, it's got to have a good middle fraction move to just get in position, and then it's got to run like a bat out of hell down the stretch and get there. And so typically when you see front runners, a lot of times the numbers are pretty flat. Sometimes depending on the track, you might even have a slight negative number where you have a higher middle fraction than a come home fraction. But I'll tell you, there's very few closers that are ever going to get there, deep closers, if you don't have a good middle fraction and then a much higher, maybe 5 points higher final fraction. And so a lot of times, again, once you've gone through the distance and the class considerations and the pace considerations, once you're down to whoever you think has a shot, you've got to make sure that the par numbers represent kind of what that horse's style is. If it's a front runner, it can be flat to slightly negative, but not much. A presser needs to be gaining at least 1, 2, 3 lengths or something between the middle fraction, the final fraction, and then the come home time for the deep closers again has to be substantially larger than the middle fraction. And so that's how we get to the par numbers to begin with, and further exercises here within these videos we'll talk about how to really apply them in real time.